to have these conversations virtually. I want to thank you all for your leadership over many years talking about the issues that Congress people raise. And I think what makes me most excited about this moment is not the declarations that racism is bad or the declaration that racism is real, or even the declarations that we have to eradicate white supremacy in all its forms in our society, but that we're committed to doing something about it. I was heartened to see the 10 demands. I actually met with the city manager and the police chief this afternoon to go over each and every one of them, because I think, again, we're not just talking about the violence of police brutality. We're talking about the violence of poverty. We're talking about the violence of lack of opportunity. We're talking about the violence of inferior schools. We're talking about the violence of inadequate healthcare. We're talking about the violence that's structural, that permeates our society, and policing and police brutality, while important, is just a symptom. So I'm excited, not just for this conversation, but for these actions that will come as a result of this conversation on this issue. I'm also excited to work and hopefully see demands on the host of issues facing our community, particularly as the congressman said. As we know, we're just in another iteration of the conversation about whether that 400-year-ago declaration of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and just basic human rights, are they afforded to everyone in this country, in our city, in our county? And if so, where's the proof in the pudding? So again, count me as your partner in this work. It's been a tough week and a rough week, but I've been inspired by the young people in the community coming together and saying that this time it will be different, and we'll continue to move the ball forward to get to a more just and a more perfect union.
Okay, thank you, Mayor Tubbs. And now we will have Board Chair Supervisor Kathy Miller.
Good evening, everybody. I want to thank the NAACP and your leadership team for putting this together. This has been a very hard week for all of us, but I would say it has also been, as a Stocktonian, a really good week. See that Stockton has come together over and over all week long and demonstrated peacefully and protested safely. I think that is a testament to the work that's been done for the last several years in Stockton. The fact that the police chief has spent time listening, the fact that we've had strong leadership in the mayor's office. So there's been a lot, from my standpoint, there's been a lot of positive messages that have also been heard. I would echo partially what Congressman Harder said. You know, as a mother, we always feel fearful for our children's safety. I'm a mother of 2 sons, and I've never had to wonder when they went out at night if they would be stopped and made the victim of violence simply for being who they are. I have not experienced that. And so for a lot of this process, it will be listening for me. In my experience, the best solutions are crafted from the ground up. They don't come from the top down. And I think that those solutions are best reached by coming together, by listening, and by trying to understand one another and craft policies that are fair and are just and are equitable for all of us. So thank you again for putting this together.
Okay, thank you, Supervisor Miller. And Assembly Member Susan Eggman will be with us a little later on. So we want to make sure that you all know that she is invited and will be participating at the from the state level. Now it gives me great pleasure to bring to this community, new to some of you and a refamiliaration with others, Mr. Jamal Watkins, who is the Vice President of Civic Engagement for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, coming to us from Washington, D.C. Jamal, welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm happy to see you.
Yes, thank you, President Bivens, and to President Allen, and to to the community of Stockton, California. I bring you greetings on behalf of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, our President and CEO, Derek Johnson, our Chair, Leon Russell, our Vice Chair, Karen Boykin-Towns. It is important that as we have these critical conversations across the nation, to be joined by some of your elected officials, to Congressman McNerney, Congressman Harder, Mayor Tubbs, the Honorable Kathy Miller, and others. As we know, we are in a very critical moment in this country, and the world is watching. We learned on Sunday that there were hundreds of protests and gatherings around the globe, actually focusing in on the United States and the extrajudicial killings that we are wrestling with. And so as we think about this moment and this political reality and COVID-19, we know that the fight that's happening in cities like Stockton, California, are really about a fight in this country to really make America what it ought to be. And so as we dialogue this evening, as we really sort through what matters most, I'm hopeful and grateful that you as volunteers, as leaders, are really gonna help shape a path forward that gives us really a glimpse into what a new normal looks like and what America should be and ought to be, because you all represent the best of what this country is. And so really excited about having this conversation, not because it's a joyous occasion, but because we know that the work has to get done and the fight really is a local fight. So thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to digging in this evening.
And I want to thank you, Jamal, for coming on with us this late at night from the East Coast. So thank you. Now I'd like to bring on the former mayor of Oakland, former assemblyman, practicing attorney, an individual who has been through some of these battles previously, to give us a little bit more of encouragement, because Stockton is a city that's capable of making transition, and most importantly, making it in a quick way and impactful way that large cities can't do. So without any further ado, I'd like to bring on Elihu Harris, former mayor of Oakland. Elihu, welcome for joining us tonight. We can't hear you. Your mic is not on. Do we have him unmuted? Still can't hear you.
He's muted.
Okay. Okay, while you're getting help, let's flip the screen and we'll come back to Mr. Harris. And I think that it's important, one, to note that Mayor Tubbs and Supervisor Miller at the local level have been being at the leadership of trying to promote progressive change. And I know that they will speak about that in the question and answer section of this meeting. I know that we're all very happy that Stockton, even though we've had our demonstrations, they have not been reflective of the rest of America. And that's a very positive thing due to the leadership and the citizens in the city of Stockton. We have been able to have protests without mass destruction. So we will not have to spend a lot of our tax dollars going back to fix things up where those folks that are not serious about positive change have tore them up. So we're to be congratulated here in Stockton for that. And so are you ready now, Mr. Harris?
I'm ready. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Well, first of all, welcome. I'm really excited. I love Stockton. And I love the fact that you have a sense of community and that you have so many of your elected officials present. And they all seem to be on the same page. The real problem, we are like speaking to the congregation and the choir. We've got to get out and get the broader community involved in this conversation, because this is not a new conversation. It's going on not only for 400 years, but there's been on average 60 unarmed Black men a year killed by the police. So we have a systemic problem as well as a classical institutional racial problem. If we're going to deal with this, we're going to have to not only be vigilant, we're going to have to be determined, there's going to have to be accountability. The first thing we're going to have to do is get police officers who have the right heart for the job, who have the right mind for the job. Then we have to make sure they're following the right policy. If we don't do those things, all of this is a waste of time and a lot of conversation. This has been going on for for years. I fought it in Oakland, and the police unions fight reform. We have to understand the police are accountable to the civilian government, not the other way around. And we can't let the police be a political force that overcomes right and morality. This is not about a war with the police. This is about cultural changes in the police department that are absolutely demanded. We don't have a choice. We've got to stand up and say, we want justice and equality for every citizen in our city. That includes the police, but does not give the police the right to kill. They're not 007. They're not James Bond. They do not have a license to kill. They have a license and a responsibility to protect and to serve. When they don't want to do that, they ought to get another job and seek another profession. So I don't argue with police about that. I want to join hands with the police and say, let's stop the rotten apples. Don't try to defend them. Get rid of them. They can find another job. Get rid of them before they kill somebody, before we're having these kinds of discussions, these kind of rebellions that some people call riots and looting, that ultimately are just dissatisfaction and frustration because they talked, they fought, they've argued, they demonstrated, they marched for dozens, hundreds of years without change. So if today is the day, the only reason we're having this conversation is because of a camera that caught Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia being killed and George Floyd in Minneapolis being killed. Without a camera, most of this country would be in denial that this was either wrong or even maybe that it happened. We have now have evidence that only somebody who is insane could ignore. So now we're talking about solutions, but we've got to have accountability. Without accountability, solutions mean nothing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. We appreciate your wisdom, your leadership, and we know we can count on you to be a part of the team to help us walk through this process going forward. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the fact that we do have on the call City Councilwoman Rhodesia Ransom from Tracy, and also City Councilwoman Christina Fugazi from Stockton are listening in on this meeting tonight. So as other elected officials come on, we will acknowledge the fact that they are here with us tonight. Okay, moving forward, it is now time to have questions for our panelists, and we will start out with Mayor Tubbs. Mr. Evan Wade will be asking the questions, Mayor.
All right, Mayor Tubbs, thank you for once again being here today. For our rounds, we'll have 2 questions each asked, and then from there we'll open up for broader Q&A. And so my first question to you, Mayor Tubbs, is kind of a 2-part question, and so it's 2 parts to your response. The local government workforce, particularly amongst law enforcement, continues to struggle to reflect the community of which it serves. The most glaring disparities are amongst people of color. Would you support city funds being used for the recruitment and retention of African-American officers in Stockton, in addition to publishing the data on racial disparities?
Well, thank you. Off mute. Thank you for that question. As everyone knows, we don't have enough African-American officers in the police department. Unfortunately, that's a long-standing issue, like many of the issues we're discussing today. In regards to budgets, it's a matter of resources. So in the current budget, there's no resources for extra recruitment and retention efforts, particularly to African-American officers. If that's the desire of the community, if that's the priority of the entire community, then I think the council will be able to make that decision. We just haven't heard, or I haven't heard anything to that front during the last 2 months as we've developed this budget that we'll be discussing later this week. So in this budget right now, there's no extra incentive for African-American officers, although has been for the last several years recruitment efforts. I think the chief spoke to some of them last week to make sure our police force is reflective of the community that they serve.
All right, and just for clarity, because we have yourself as an African-American mayor, we have a Black city manager as well too. Have you guys identified that as a priority, the recruiting and retaining of African-American officers? I believe currently we have less than 10 for the city of Stockton. It's
been a long-standing priority. Our city manager just came on board February, so his first priority was COVID-19. So he's been really working incredibly hard on that. But before that, if you look at all of our police department strategic plans, diversity, reflecting our workforce has been a priority for the last couple of years. So it remains a priority. It's something we're deeply committed to and could use a lot of help in terms of sourcing and finding people, in addition to the recruitment efforts that we're currently doing.
And do you want to address publishing racial disparities?
Absolutely. All of our city records are public records. So anyone can send an email or a public records request and asking for that data, but folks shouldn't have to. So I'll go back and talk to our city manager and see what we can do to publish that number. It's just that hiring officers takes time. So numbers that'll be published will be stagnant for quite some time as folks go through the process. But I think at the very least, we should be able to do that.
Okay. And just one more question. In the NAACP Stockton Branch 10-point plan of action, we call for all police personnel to be vetted prior to the hire for disciplinary issues and or termination for over-policing and police abuse. We need comprehensive screening. What can you do to use your platform as mayor to bring about these changes?
Yeah, I think, and thank you for the question. I think the question is, what have we done? So again, I met with the police chief today to go over each of the 10 demands. And I think this is demand number 5. And we do this currently. We do not hire officers on the Brady list, and we currently screen for misconduct prior to hiring. But even the other items in the 10-point plan, from the no neck restraint policies, we have that. A ban on the use of knee holds and choke holds, we have that. Implementation of a citizens review board for the city of Stockton. The city manager, the police chief will have a plan for the public and for the council by the end of the summer. A youth seat on the youth advisory committee to brief law enforcement. There's currently 2 seats on the chief's advisory board for youth. Additionally, they just formed a youth advisory board a couple months ago that they're beginning to roll out. So again, I think Stockton is not perfect, but we've been really leading this work. And that's why last year we led the state in declining officer-involved shootings. That's why our officers go and do procedural justice training for the police departments. And not because we're perfect, but since 2013, we've been doing the things that people are calling for and understanding that the best way to stay ready is to get raised to stay ready, and ensuring that we're in communication with our community and working to become a better police department when there's a hashtag and when there's not.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mayor Tubbs, and thank you, Professor Wade. Next, we have DeAndrea Davey will be raising questions with Board Chair Kathy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Bivens. So Supervisor Kathy Miller, the law enforcement often respond to violent situations and crisis, and many work with high levels of gun violence and regularly bear witness to human. This puts them under great physical and mental stress, which can undermine their health and well-being and affect other parts of their lives. These effects go beyond themselves. They also affect loved ones and family members. So the first question is, on our 10-point plan, we call for mandated psychological evaluation of law enforcement should take place for personnel who had more than 2 excessive force violations and or shooting incidents. Will you support this change? And if so, are you willing to take action to the Board of Supervisors?
Well, thank you for the question. And I agree with you that the tremendous strain that law enforcement officers are under, it does impact their families. And I think that's a reality that does need to be addressed. And yes, I think it should be standard that when one of these huge events happens in an officer's work life, the whole person should be looked at. So yes, I'm not familiar with all the ramifications of that, but I can definitely say that I would be willing to open up that conversation and work with our sheriff, our district attorney, and county management to take a look at this issue.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, we all watched last week when the medical examiner manipulated the findings of Mr. Floyd's death, which caused further trauma to the family and community. What accountability policies have you put in place for our new medical examiner that will oversee the coroner's office?
Well, one of the reasons why we moved to a medical examiner was to help with the public's perception of impartiality. We wanted to remove the medical examiner, the entire office, from any form of oversight by the Sheriff's Department and law enforcement. We believe that it's critically important to have an independent medical examiner that is basing decisions on science and data and on their background as a medical expert, not mixing in law enforcement issues. And so the medical examiner was hired. It was a very rigorous vetting of the medical examiner. And one of the key components was we wanted to make sure that we hired someone not just with medical experience, but someone who had the administrative expertise to actually establish an office, bring on staff, and set up protocols so that the top priority would be an independent ME's office. So to date, the board has made it very, very clear that that is the expectation.
Okay, thank you. And we will have more questions later on in the general session.
Sure.
My microphone was off, excuse me. We will now have Mr. Naji Zarif, who will ask questions of Congressman Jerry McNerney.
Good evening, Congressman McNerney, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for your service to our community. As part of your opening statement, you started to go into legislation that has been considered to address the issues of racial discrimination and racial inequality in this country. I would like for you to take a moment to maybe speak on that legislation, whether it's currently proposed or anticipated.
Well, thank you, Najee. Yes, the legislation that was introduced this morning, it's HR 7120. It's called Justice and Policing Act of 2020. Now, this legislation subsumes a lot of other ideas that have proposed lately that myself and most of my colleagues have already agreed to sponsor. This one does a couple of things that are specifically important right now. It eliminates the qualified immunity so that individuals are not barred from recovering damages when their constitutional rights are violated, and it incentivizes states to create independent investigation agencies through grants. It improves transparency in policing, and it, among other things, I think critically important at this point after the experience in Minnesota, is it bans chokeholds and carotid artery holes. So those are some of the specific things in this one piece of legislation. There's other pieces of legislation concerning police brutality. There's HRES 899. This one basically has the House call out a resolution banning police brutality, supports the limits, efforts to eliminate excessive use of force, creates transparency within police departments. And then there's others, but I think those are some of the key pieces of legislation. And the great news is that with the momentum we're seeing on these issues, that they have a wide co-sponsorship. I think the Justice and Policing Act had 166 Democrats signed onto it as co-sponsors this morning, the same day it was introduced, which is quite a large number for this early in the legislative cycle. We hope to see that legislation ready after committee work and for voting on the House floor late this month or early the first month of July.
Thank you. The second question, while local protests and protests throughout the country have been peaceful, we are receiving and hearing numerous reports of law enforcement intimidating peaceful protesters with military equipment that has been granted to them from the Department of Defense through the 1033 program. This use of this unnecessary equipment often escalates tensions between law enforcement and the public that they serve. The question we have is, what steps will you take to roll back this program and restrict the ability of law enforcement to use military equipment when citizens are exercising their right to peaceful protest?
Absolutely, that's a very important question. I'm glad you asked that. Certainly when you see military hardware rolling down the streets, you're going to be reacting emotionally to that, and you're going to feel like these people are preparing for battle, and that's not the message that we want to make. And so it's important that when we have grants at the federal level, we have grants that it includes provisions to prevent the use of that money in a way that militarizes the police forces. And I think there is legislation out there. For example, the Eric Garner Excessive Use of Force Prevention Act, HR 4408 by Hakeem Jeffries, and there's others that will be coming along, and I'm going to be strongly supporting that effort. We don't want to see a military. In fact, we want to see the existing police department scale back that military sort of approach and use that money more wisely within the police department. And also, we want to beef up social services so that social services can match the level of funding for enforcement. And that's the way we're going to start developing trust and peace in our neighborhoods. And I just want to give a shout out to Mayor Harris. He mentioned that we shouldn't have money, we shouldn't politicize police forces. And you know, the United States military has an ideal of being apolitical, of not being involved in the politics, and getting our police forces to have that same ideal, I think, is a key. If we move in that direction. And the 10th point in the NAACP's requirements are a ban on police union campaign donations to prosecutors. I feel strongly that that's the right direction. We need to make sure that that has constitutional muster, that sort of approach. We don't want the police, friends of police, to be using financial resources to protect themselves from oversight. And so I just want to give Mayor Harris a shout out on that comment.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Congressman McNerney and Najee.
No,
Now we'll have Congressman Harder, and we will have Jerome Clay asking the questions of Congressman Harder.
Good evening, Congressman Harder. How are you doing?
Doing well.
Okay, I have a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King, and it said, "I can't pass legislation to make you love me, but I can pass legislation to make you stop you from lynching me." So my question is, with the Congressional Black Caucus, how they have that policy act of 2020 that makes lynching a federal crime, can you speak to your position as it relates to supporting the Black Caucus?
Yeah. So I voted for that bill to ban or essentially to make lynching a federal crime. Right now, we're seeing it being held up in the Senate by one person, Rand Paul, who doesn't agree with it. And first of all, I think that's very heartbreaking to see at a moment where we are seeing so much tragedy across the country. But I also think it's a symbol of how broken our political institutions are when one person can hold up a bill that 99 other people support. And my hope is that we'll be able to bring that vote. I mean, that's in the Senate. It's passed the House. My hope is that the Senate will reconsider their rules and hold that into to a vote. The other thing that we're working on, which is what Mr. McNerney talked about, which is the Justice and Policing Act, and he described it really well. But what I'd sort of think of it as, you know, to your question, is having two really important component parts. One are setting very clear standards for what acceptable police behavior should be. This is the first comprehensive police reform bill that has ever come in front of Congress in our history. And so setting very clear national standards for use of force, banning things like chokeholds, and then also making sure that we're setting a very high standard for not just a reasonable use of force, which is the current standard, but moving that to a necessary standard of force. So you actually have to prove a much higher standard when folks are using force on the job. And the second thing that this bill does is creates real accountability. We really need to make sure that we're rebuilding trust, making sure that the police are held accountable. And it's too hard to do that right now. And so this is going to create a federal oversight board, similar. Think about what we did for the Voting Rights Act in 1965, where we had states that were pursuing voter suppression, not allowing African Americans to vote in the South, especially. We used the federal government to come on in and make sure that the law was being upheld. That's the same thing we need to be doing on policing. We need to make sure that there is federal oversight and accountability. So police departments that aren't following the law, police departments that are not satisfying that accountability and clear standards, that we're being able to make sure that we're fixing those wrongs. So that's some of the things. This bill was just dropped this morning, so we're still digesting it, but I really recommend a lot of folks take a look at it, see if you have additions, suggestions. I really want to make sure that we're hearing from our community. Although I will say, of course, one of the policy directors of the Congressional Black Caucus, our own San Joaquin native and Mr. Bivens' son, Exodi Rowe, had a big hand in this. So we know that it was at least understood here in the Valley.
You said something earlier about reasonable versus necessary as it relates to the police officers. Can you really explain to our viewers what that means as it relates to the law enforcement?
So right now, if somebody alleges that a police officer is using excessive force, then all an officer has to do is say, in a court of law, explain in a hearing that that use of force was reasonable. And that standard, well, everybody can reason for a particular thing. And so it's ends up in practice being something that it becomes very hard to prove that excessive force is being used. And one of the things that, and California, by the way, has been a leader in already changing that standard from reasonable to necessary. That was done just a little while ago in California, but this would take that national and say that nationally you have to actually prove if you are using excessive force, as we've tragically seen again and again and again on these video that we're having in the social media age. If you can prove that was you have to prove that was necessary in order to make sure that you don't have to be accountable for that behavior. That is a much higher standard. And so in setting that high standard, we also need to make sure that we're enforcing it through those accountability measures. Does that explanation make sense?
Yes, it does. And then my second question is this. As you know, why we're here today, because of the outrage pertaining to George Floyd. And so my thing is dealing with the First Amendment and the protection of the First Amendment. So can you comment on, some of the actions taken by the president and AG Barr as it relates to the First Amendment and people that are actually peacefully protesting?
Yeah, well, yeah, you said it. We have a First Amendment, a freedom of speech, and a freedom to assembly. And the vast majority of protesters all across our country, and especially the folks that we've seen in DC, are being peaceful. And I think when the president and his administration force tear gas or whatever they want, pepper spray, they're now saying on peaceful protesters just to have a photo op, then it shows, I think, a deep sense of misplaced priorities. Let's focus on the core problem here. Why are our hearts breaking? Why are we having millions of people all across the globe take to the streets peacefully? Because we want justice. We want something to be done. And let's channel all of that frustration, all of that anger, both to the criminal justice reforms that we're talking about today, but even more broadly to the deep inequalities that we have in our education system, in our housing system, in our healthcare system. I mean, we've been going through this coronavirus pandemic where disproportionately Black and brown members of our community have been more at risk from coronavirus than Caucasians. That is very revealing. And that's one of the things that we need to be dealing with. So, I think for folks to go off and to, use pepper spray on protesters just for a photo op shows a real misunderstanding of what people are feeling. And let's get to work and get something done.
Okay. And then my last question is this. What actions are you going to take as a consequence of the flagrant disregard of fundamental values, which are profoundly important to a dysfunctioning democracy?
Yeah, well, I think let's pass a bill that actually creates these standards and accountability mechanisms. This is the justice and policing bill that we were talking about, which we're still digesting. But more broadly, I don't think this is something that's just on Congress. I think this is something that's on all of us. Earlier today, I met with many of the young organizers that have organized some of these protests across our community. And it was really heartening. For one, it was encouraging just to see young people getting involved. Most of the people that are organizing these protests in our area are high school and college kids. A lot of these organizations didn't exist 2 weeks ago. And they are now community leaders. Oftentimes we say the youth are future leaders. These are the present leaders of our community on this issue. And we need to make sure that their voice is heard. And I think the job in Congress is to make sure that we're passing bills. We're already working on that. But fundamentally, we're also going to have to take a look at the ballot box. And I think somebody said this earlier. I think we need to make sure that we are winning elections in accordance with the voice and the principles that we're hearing across our community. And my hope is that that is where all of this is going to be channeled because we need it to lead to change. I think we are sick and tired of having these conversations over and over again. We need to make sure that we're taking this momentum and hopefully putting it to good use.
Thank you so much, Congressman Harder.
Okay, next we will have Deborah Sullivan ready to raise the questions with our state legislator, Susan Eggman. Is Susan on yet?
No.
If not, we will move on to.
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
You're here? Okay, great. Okay, so Deborah will be raising the questions of Assemblywoman Susan Eggman.
All right. Hi, everybody.
Good evening. Hi, how are you today?
All right.
Okay. Recently, attention has been brought to the undue influence of the police union and protecting criminal officers through lies and distortion and CBA agreements that favored wrongful dismissals and excessive force cases, provided for security under the gust of personal privacy, of wrongdoing, even serial wrongdoing, and allow them to continue as law enforcement officers. Some seems disunion as part of the problem and not the solution. Please comment on this issue regarding the local law enforcement and the response to brutality allegation.
Do you want me to respond to the issue about police unions or about local policing?
Okay, the question is yes, local law enforcement, yes.
Okay, so local law enforcement, I mean, I have been on the forefront of trying to push criminal justice reform and things that you know, that we need to get rid of cops who aren't doing the work of the people. And so I have been pretty consistent on that during my time in the state legislature. And because of my positions, I don't receive a lot of donations from police unions. So it hasn't really been an issue. There's not one local police union who has endorsed me the last couple of times I've run for office, and I still remain successful. So I think that people appreciate somebody who's willing to stand up to be able to really speak on behalf of the community and not just the organization of the union.
The tragic incident with George Floyd was just one symbol of our biggest disease.
Can't hear you very good,
Racial
Deborah, I don't think she can hear you.
In the United States. Besides the criminal justice system, this disease is it is our education, employment, housing, voting, and immigration system. Can you please share your thoughts on how we combat these issues and the actions you intend to take moving forward?
Yes, well, I have been a long advocate for CSU Stockton. Unless we have true educational opportunities in our community, I don't think we ever rise to our full potential. We have 4 state prison facilities and not 1 public university. So I think we have to start there around this issue of equity. I think it's not enough just to talk about equality. I think it has to be equity. So that on education. On healthcare issues, I have voted to expand healthcare rights to as many people as possible, regardless of their documentation status. I've also voted to get rid of private prisons. They are now unlawful in the state of California and are closing. I am a co-author on ACA 5, which we'll be able to put back to the voters if we need affirmative action back in our decision-making process. And I'm a co-author on Mike Gibson's bill that he just put forward to outlaw the corduroy hold. So that's just kind of across multiple areas, the work I've been working on and doing and what I believe.
Okay, well, thank you so much for those answers. That concludes my question. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assemblywoman and Deborah. And now we will get to the general question section, and we will also have questions coming from the chat box as well. So at this point, I will turn it over to Deidrea Davey to field the questions, the general questions, and also to work with the questions in the chat box.
Okay, there was a question from the chat box, and I believe Mayor Tubbs would like to respond to it. And the question is from Summer, and I'm sorry I don't have your last name right now. But I have heard a lot of talk about reforms, but where does the NAACP and elected officials and candidates stand when it comes to defunding police and reallocate the bloated police budgets toward education, social services, and dismantling racial inequality?
Praying. Amen. Praise him.
I just got home and there's a big rally at Victory Park. That's what you can hear.
Look at Susan, listen to, okay.
I'm sorry.
We may need to have you walk out to the rally.
Yeah, to the rally next.
See.
People are texting me, there's a rally. I'm like, I've got a Zoom I got to do. I'm rushing around.
Well, but first, thank you so much for this question. And I think the question really highlights how, particularly on this issue is so life and death, bread and butter. It speaks to what we invest in, that we have to make sure we have accurate information. So in your city, the city of Stockton, there's 2 taxpayer-funded tax measures that make up our police budget. In 2005, the taxpayers, your mama and them, your aunties, your uncles, the adults, voted for something called Measure W, which pays for police staffing, and that money has to go to police staffing. In 2013, the city of Stockton, the voters approved Measure A and B, which is another tax where 66% of that money has to go to our Office of Violence Prevention and our police department. So when we talk about defunding police in a Stockton context, we have to be cognizant that it's not going to be something that could be a vote. It's going to have to be of the council. It have to be a vote of the people. So if folks are really serious about this, I would implore you to organize a ballot initiative, just like the people who put the tax measures in place to fund our police department did in 2013 and 2005. But I do think the wider point is one that makes sense. It's that in our society, we seem to have cops be the answers for everything. But I know I had a couple conversations today where people were saying, let's not fund cops, let's fund schools. And again, that makes sense for Stockton Unified, which has its own police department, but the city of Stockton as an organization doesn't fund schools. There's a separate budget and property tax for that. And if you're interested in funding schools, there's actually a statewide ballot measure called Schools and Community First that you can support and join on to increase funding for schools. And then the last thing I would say, I think I agree with the point about the need for social workers, the need for mental health therapists. But again, the city of Stockton does not provide those services. Those aren't city functions. Those are county functions. Those are hospital functions. So again, in this conversation, particularly because it's something we're all viscerally, we see what's so clearly what's wrong. But to get to what's right, we have to actually educate ourselves on the systems and the funding streams so we're making the appropriate acts to the right people. And the last thing I would say is I think what would be prudent is if we had a community conversation about where should marijuana money go? Because we have marijuana is legalized, and that money with the ballot measure could be used in this community to fund communities of colors, could be used in this community to fund all the services we so desperately need. And I would be happy to be front and center on that. But again, it has to be the community educated and organized to make the right ask, to get the right results and the results that we deserve, to have a community that has more than just cops, that has things for our kids to do, that has well-funded schools, and has mental health professionals and social workers to address all the needs that we have.
Mayor Tubbs, I'm gonna jump in, Dee Dee, and I put Dee Dee on the spot because we had identified some other folks to handle this session, so I'm gonna pull her off the spot and have Lawana and Brandon handle that as the script had called for, and I went off script as usual. But you said something related to Measure A, and if I understood you correctly, you said that I think 60% or 66% of the funds was to go to policing and OVP. Did I understand you? Would you be willing to take to the council the expansion of the funding of OVP and include community organizations in assisting in the violence prevention in our community? Because currently, as I looked at the funding in the budget, it's OVP is only getting a very small part of that. And in other communities, OVP gets a much larger piece of the pie so that they can have community organizations that are working with it so that they can address the issue in a multifaceted way. Would you be willing to take that forward to the council?
Clearly, you hear my son advocating for that in the background. He's in agreement. We need more provision. I think, again, in the Stockton context, the way Measure A and B was worded, it was worded as 120 officers. So that's why the majority of that money goes to the police department, because the voters voted for 120 officers, and that's expensive, and that was the desire of the people. But to your point, we just submitted a grant actually to the state to increase the OVP budget by 100% through CalVIP funding. And part of that application will include sub-grants to community organizations. I know a lot of folks on this call are now into like community interventions of policing, and I thank you for your leadership on this, Mr. Bivens, because I also realize that many people on this call, including some elected officials, were against the Advanced Peace Program, which was about community intervention, which was about investing in community to prevent gun violence, not using cops for everything, and using outside dollars to do that. And we had very visceral community reaction, like that's a bad thing. So again, I think this is another opportunity for us as a community to say we believe in community-based approaches to law enforcement. We believe that we need to increase our budget for OVP. We believe in the capacity of the community to handle crime, because it's a little bit confusing for me, frankly, as an elected official, to have a conversation about spend more money to hire more Black officers, and in the next breath have a conversation about defunding. We can't do both. But I think if we get real clear on what we want, which I think is a holistic approach to public safety, I'm confident we could get there.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. And I'm going to turn this over to the folks that are supposed to be doing it and take myself out of the picture. Thank you.
Thank you, President Bivens. I have 3 questions that were sent in earlier, and then Brandon will have some also. The first one is for either Mayor Tubbs or Chair Member or Person Miller. And it asks, what is the current protocol for law enforcement officers who have domestic violence incidents, restraining orders, and other convictions? And Mayor Tubbs or either Madam Kathy Miller.
Yeah, I am not the expert on HR or police, like every police rule, but if you send me that question in an email, I will forward it to the chief and try to get an answer before we adjourn tonight.
Thank you. I will do that. The next is for Mr. Jamal Watkins, if you're still on. And the question asks, how is the national NAACP working with Congress to address police reform and criminal justice reform?
That's a great question. I would say there's 3 levels to our engagement on the national level. First and foremost, it starts with sessions like you're having right now. Because we are 2.4 million volunteer members, advocates, and activists around the country, or hyper-local, we need you all to actually be engaging with your local electeds because each state is vastly different. Last night, I had the privilege of being on a session that featured Congressman Hank Johnson and folks in the Atlanta metro area. And so when we think about engaging at the national level, it starts hyper-local. As you heard from your mayor, how you all fund the local law enforcement is unique to Stockton, California, which may be very different than in Southern California, say Los Angeles County. So your elected officials have to know and hear from you at that level first and foremost. The second tier is when we really engage at the national level in regards to federal policy. And so, as you all know, the new legislation that's been introduced around creating a national police misconduct registry or limiting the transfer of military-grade weapons to local law enforcement or bumping up the requirement for the use of body cams. There's different layers to that legislation that we as a national team are advocating for with your House members at the congressional level. But then there's another level, which I would argue is the US Senate. And that's tricky because you have 2 senators who we know are fighting for you and fighting forward. As you heard, there are other senators like Rand Paul or the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell. And so what we try to do is focus all of our volunteer energy to say and put pressure on the Senate Majority Leader so that they're not obstructing the passage of good legislation that we know is coming from the House side. And so it's a threefold system, but it really starts with you all as voters and as constituents, making sure that, you know, congressmen like McNerney, for example, are really getting your support so that when he's on the Hill, he can fight for the policies that then we are able to double down on and advocate for at the federal level.
Okay. This next question is from the chat box from Mr. Singh, and it says, Mayor Tubbs, at the local level, can we ensure our law enforcement receive more training than the basic post requirements and possibly have individuals and our organizations such as the NAACP involved in the hiring process?
So to the first part of the question, first, thank you for the question. I definitely think that policing is a very difficult job, so they should have all the training possible, and it has to be ongoing and not one time. And that's exactly what our police department does. So there's ongoing implicit bias training, there's ongoing procedural justice training, there's ongoing mental health training and how to respond to a mental health incident training. And that training has been happening since 2014 because it's something we just believe deeply in. Before people need to flood the streets and get our attention. We just knew that we had to police different and in a better way, which doesn't mean we don't have work to do, right? But it does mean that the work that many folks are calling for, we've been doing. It's going to take some time to see the fruits, but I think we've already seen it again with us leading the state. Again, you guys should be proud of this. Your city led the state in a decline in officer-involved shootings, and your city was ranked #1 in the country for the work the police chief and police department has been doing and meeting with leaders like Mr. Bivens and some of you on this call on reconciliation. And then the second part of the question was, or was that the first question?
The second, getting back to it, the second part of the question was, and I'm going through the chat box, so you kind of caught me off.
I think I answered it.
The second part was to, and I can kind of summarize it, but to expand the hiring panel to include outside organizations such as the NAACP.
I think for outside folks who have kind of the experience and the expertise in human relations and interviewing and hiring, they should absolutely apply to be part of our Civil Service Commission, which looks at hiring practices and procedures, or even apply to work for the City of Stockton's HR department. I wouldn't be comfortable, frankly, having hiring of city employees not done by the folks I can hold accountable for when they make a bad hire. I think for big hires like police chief and things like that, there should always be some sort of community input onto that in terms of leadership. But in terms of day-to-day line officers, I'm just not, I would rather our HR professionals, our background investigators do that hiring with significant, when the public continue to put pressure in terms of the standards we use to hire.
Okay, Brandon, are you ready?
Yes, ma'am, I am. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mayor Tubbs, the Honorable Congressman, as well as our Vice President of NAACP, Mr. Jamal Watkins. So the question I have, in the African-American community, we need more money invested in crime prevention. And this can go out to any of the elected officials, but do you feel our crime prevention budget is adequate, or are you increasing funding to address issues on the front end? And that's for anyone to answer.
Can I take a shot at it?
Sure.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you for the question. And first of all, I want to put this in the context of the defund police idea, because we've seen the president and his operatives use that and other terms like Black Lives Matter, the Green New Deal, Obamacare. We've seen them weaponize those terms and use those as a bludgeon against Democrats. And so what I want to do is be careful in how we use our terminology so that we don't set ourselves up for future problems. But the important point here has two sides. First of all, when we allocate money to a police or a police agency, a sheriff's agency, we have to have oversight to make sure that money is spent properly. It's spent wisely. We don't want to spend money on military hardware. We don't want to spend money that's not going to help the public interest. And on the other hand, we want to make sure that we spend an adequate amount of money on the social needs, whether it's education, whether it's social services, childcare, healthcare, things that are going to make life reasonable for large segments of the society. And if we don't do those two things, we're not going to catch up with this problem. So I think that's the kind of idea we ought to be looking at, is how to talk about this in terms of fairness, how to talk about it in terms of equity, not in terms of negatives that can be used against us.
If I can jump in there, I actually completely agree with what Mr. McNerney said. And I think one of the things that we can really be doing to focus on crime prevention is fully fund the social work aspects of what police officers do. I do a lot of ride-alongs with our police officers because it's a way to get a firsthand perspective of what they actually go through. I actually encourage everybody, whatever your views of law enforcement are. It's actually everybody's welcome, and I think it's a really interesting opportunity just to see. And one of the things that you'll see is so much of what we ask police officers to do is deal with homelessness, deal with folks with mental health issues, their substance abuse issues. So much of that should be in the hands of social workers. I introduced legislation last year to make sure that we were putting social workers front and center in every single community. So instead of somebody showing up to a situation where there may be somebody with a mental health issue, instead of that person being a cop with a gun, you have a social worker who goes out and deals with that. And I think that's so much of what we're seeing across the Central Valley. It would go a long way towards making sure that we're dealing with the issues that are arising with the folks who are best equipped to deal with the root causes of those behavioral challenges that we're seeing. And that's the part that we really should be focusing on from a budget perspective across our whole country.
Thank you, Congressman McNerney and Congressman Hardy.
Miller, if I can just jump in real quickly on this.
Yes, ma'am.
In terms of investing, we know there has been a lack of investment upstream, especially in our children, and providing the services that absolutely go to crime prevention. And for the last 7-8 years, I've worked with the Children's Alliance in San Joaquin County to identify the gaps in our services and to identify a sustainable funding stream. We got Measure B on the ballot to for the unincorporated area to tax newly legal cannabis businesses, with 50% of those dollars going to set up a children's fund for San Joaquin County for our children, our youth, and our families that need this assistance the most. We barely missed it. On the 16th of June, the Children's Alliance is coming back to the board along with the Children and Youth Task Force to make a presentation from the task force on the needs of our youth 13 to 18 years old. But the Children's Alliance is going to make the pitch to the Board of Supervisors to put a Measure B 2.0, whatever it ends up being called, but to put it back on the ballot in November. If everybody on this call wants something very concrete that they can do to help support funding that will go directly to prevention for our kids, it will be send in your comments to the Board of Supervisors and let them know that there is widespread community support for doing this and creating our first ever children's fund in San Joaquin County. Thanks.
Right.
Thank
And if
you
I
so
could,
much,
may I
Madam.
jump in real quick too?
Yes, ma'am.
May I jump in? And I just
Yes,
I just want to jump in as a social worker in the crowd here, as a professional social worker. I have long advocated to have social workers more involved on the front end, on the streets, as well as I've done a bill, I think every year I've been in office, that has never made it, but to have a social worker in every Title I school to be able to provide support for families and kids. But I would also like to say that if we want to replace social workers with police officers on the street, we also need to reimburse them at the same kind of rates as we do for public safety officers. Historically, social work has been a profession of women, and it has been very low paid. Whereas on the other hand, law enforcement has been a profession of men, and it has been fairly well paid. So I am all in favor of having more social workers on the front line, but I also think we also need to think about where our values are and what we value. Most social workers also have they have a bachelor's degree, they have a master's degree, they are licensed. I see my sister Kimberly Wormsley on here, they are licensed. That is a lot of school and education. And we start off making significantly less than a public safety officer who often has a high school diploma. So I'm all for getting more social workers out there on the front lines and providing the services people need. And I would also just make a pitch that we put our money where our mouth is when we talk about what we value and how we value that.
Brandon, this is Jamal. I just wanted to add something that I don't want folks to miss, is that there are studies that have shown that police expenditure over the last 40 years has remained pretty flat. on average across all states at around 4%. So a lot of the issues we're dealing with, and folks don't necessarily want to talk about it this way, is behavior, is a pattern of anti-Blackness, a pattern of racism, and a pattern of excessive force that ends up being covered up and ends up being blessed by the powers that be. And so no matter if you reduce the expenditure by 1%, 2%, 3%, 10%, if you don't change behavior and change accountability, then you're not going to get rid of the actual problem that is leading to the extrajudicial killings that we see time and time again. Now, this is not to say we don't need to invest in more social work programs, invest in education and healthcare at a higher rate, but we have to address the root source of behavior as well. Otherwise, the policing culture stays the same, whether you're spending $10 or $10 million.
And thank you, Jamal, for that message. Since we're on healthcare, I just want to bring up a question to any of the elected officials, because we're focused on social workers and mental health. As a disabled veteran myself that battle PTSD, I have a question in reference to our community. What are we going to do for the African-American culture that males at our age of 30 and 40, and even the young males who are experiencing this detriment situation? What are we going to do as a Congress or as a Senate or as a community to uplift and hire more social workers that can relate to the situation and don't have that anti-Blackness or racism against them? What are we doing for that? Or do we have anything in place? Can we put something in place to accommodate those issues? And anyone's open to answer.
To answer the question of recruiting more African Americans into social work?
No, actually, he's speaking of having more African American males engaged in those type of jobs and not having their records used against them, because oftentimes young men may run afoul with the law and don't know about the expungement or record sealing process. And so when they go to get into some of those types of jobs, they're eliminated up front based on the fact that they don't meet, quote, the criteria, when in fact we know there are non-Blacks that do get into jobs that have had those same kind of experiences. So what is our county, our state, looking at doing to improve that process, I think would be a better way to put that question.
Well, I mean, I'll just speak for social work, that there is generally not those kinds of limitations on people. There is sometimes for licensing and agencies they're hired in, but for the educational process, those barriers do not exist. And a lot of folks who come into the profession of social work have oftentimes had some kind of experience. In our own community, I mean, it's not secret to say, he talked about a lot. Jesse Delacruz was a LCSW social worker who had been, spent 25 years in prison for murder and was now back out on the streets doing things. So law enforcement is a different situation.
And just to piggyback on what the assembly member said, Brandon, you talked about the VA and some of the outreach that they're doing to vets. One of the things we need to do is we need to pay our VA workers and make sure that we have enough folks that can deliver the services that are necessary. I represent Stanislaus County as well as parts of San Joaquin, and the Modesto VA clinic 20 years ago, it had 10 nurses. Today, there are 4. And the population has skyrocketed of our veterans across the community. And I was talking to some of the nurses, and I said, what's going on? Why do we not have enough clinical staff in the Valley? Obviously, we're excited to build up French Camp and hoping we broke ground on that last year, hoping to get that moving towards completion as soon as possible. But one of the things they told me is this guy, he said, I've been working at the VA for 30 years. My daughter graduated from nursing school last month. She works in private practice. She's making more money working as a nurse at a local hospital than I'm making after 30 years at the VA. And so part of the challenge of how do we get people of color in and just more generally, more healthcare workers, more social workers, and especially people of color into these professions, is we need to compensate them accordingly. And when you are making a fraction after 30 years of what somebody's making a month out of school, it's pretty clear that that's out of whack. The Valley needs more doctors, it needs more nurses, it needs more social workers, and we need to start by making sure that those people are compensated according to the immense value that they're contributing to our community.
Right.
So I'm gonna second my colleague Josh Harder. A lot of it has to do with compensation. I mean, we have to compensate people with enough salary and the benefits, but we also have to have a status associated with those positions. I mean, social workers, nurses, teachers, they need to be looked at with awe by the community, because they're the ones that really hold the community together. So, you know, maybe that's something we can work with the NAACP and other organizations to, how do we raise the stature of these workers that are really out there doing the frontline work, the hard work that builds a community.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much.
This next question is for Assembly Member Eggman, and it's from a Mr. Roberson. It said that you mentioned getting a CSU Stockton to address education equity in Stockton. What can you do to make sure public education is equal for TK through 12 students? Right now, only 2 in 10 Black students graduate A through G qualified to attend UC and CSU.
But those struggles are ongoing. During my time in the legislature, we passed the local control funding, which was designed specifically to send more money to schools who had higher degrees of children living in poverty and children with higher needs. So the school boards are supposed to be, and parents should all be involved in those issues. So that was, we thought, one of the biggest kind of social justice bills we could have done. I think there hasn't been enough accountability on the other side of that, that we continue to have those conversations about then how do you hold the districts accountable. So those questions continue to go on. I will also say on the funding, it remains an issue. As you know, we're going into a hard budget year, and I know the NAACP has taken a position of opposition to the split roll tax, but that tax is supposed to go directly to school districts. So when we passed Prop 13 in 1974, 1978, what year was it? A long time ago. I remember my mom said, there goes the end of public education. And sure enough, we have seen the decline, that we are still some of the last in funding. And so that will be on the ballot in the fall, so people can take a look at it. I don't know it's a good time to pass a tax, but it's to say that when Prop 13 went in, it was supposed to be for people to be able to stay in their homes. It was not, I don't think, in the voters' mind intended for commercial property, but commercial property was included. And so you have big corporations like Apple and downtown in Palo Alto who are paying what they paid way before they transformed the Silicon Valley. So that will also go far to address funding, and that'll be up to the voters in November. But I have consistently worked on and tried to pass legislation to improve school standards and to hold teachers accountable.
To the Assemblywoman, I think the major issue as it relates to that with the schools is the lack of proper distribution of the funds, and with the lack of parent engagement and inclusion. And certainly here at Stockton Unified, that needs to be enhanced, but I think that's a conversation we can have at another time, because this is about law enforcement, but we absolutely need to look at the LCAP and the way the LCAP is being used. So we will move on, and we're getting close to that.
But schools and community first, Mr. Bivens, right? That's coming up.
Always.
Communities first.
We won't do that. I love you, but we're gonna on this one, and we can talk together.
We have a question for Mr. Harris, Mr. Elihu Harris. It says, what did you do when you were mayor of Oakland to advance police reform and social justice inclusive for all? Can you give us some thoughts for Stockton?
Everything. One, 70% of the city's budgets go to police and fire. So in many cases, cities are primarily police and fire commissions and not full city councils dealing with the libraries and parks and rec and so many other public works, so many other departments that most people think the city is funded to provide. They really are providing a disproportionate amount of their budgets for police and fire. But one of the things I think is absolutely essential, I think you got to have more community involvement. And while I have great respect for your mayor, you've done an incredible job, there's no problem in my estimation in having people reviewing and interviewing. The decision can be made by professionals, but the input of community, the temperament of police officers, whether or not they come across as being really committed to community, I think it's something that the hiring officials ought to consider in making placements, certainly in hiring police officers. Community policing, I think, is the essential factor that I believe I fought for in the city of Oakland. I wanted to have police officers who related to the community, who were problem solving, not just responding to crime. We had a problem in Oakland where the police officers didn't even want to get out of their car. All they wanted to do was ride around after somebody had called and pick up evidence or pick up a body. That's not what we want the police to do. We want the police to prevent crime, to protect the community, and to serve the community. And they can't do that if they're not in touch with the community, if they're not connected with the community. The other thing the community police officers can do is connect the other social services, mental health, social workers, teachers, to all be connected. When the police officer sees a problem in the community, a child who's not being parented appropriately, when there's somebody mentally ill or addicted to drugs, they ought to be able to call in social services and not another police officer to deal with that problem. We arrest too many people and don't help enough. I believe one of the things we have to do is really change the nature of policing. We expect police officers to do everything, social workers, psychologists, everything. And they're not equipped or trained. In many cases, they're very undereducated for those kinds of things. So I really believe we've got to make sure we have a connection and, more importantly, a real sense of union when it comes to how we police our communities, how we serve our community. Police officers ought to be the eyes and ears of the community, not just people who pull out their gun and shoot.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. And my last question is for both Congressman McNerney and Congressman Harder. And I think we heard you both say, talk a little bit about the 2020 Justice and Policing Act. This person wanted to know if you're both signed on as co-sponsors to the bill.
Yes, absolutely. We signed on before it was even introduced because I knew it was going to be in it, and it's the right way to go. It may not solve all of our problems, but it's a necessary and important step in the right direction.
As for me, it just got released a couple hours ago. I'm making sure that we're reading all through it. But frankly, I'd really appreciate hearing from all of our community members. That's why I met with the youth today that were leading some of the protests that we've seen across our community. I want to make sure that we're not just taking a top-down approach, but we're going really from the bottoms up and hearing directly from our community members to make sure that those concerns are being addressed in this piece of legislation. So for anybody on the call, please get in touch with me. Please get in touch with our office. If there's things that you think have been missed or things that you don't think we get quite right, please let us know. We're hoping to move that forward to a vote in the next couple weeks.
Thank you both.
Okay.
Ms. Givens, I return it to you.
Thank you very much. And as the congressional representative said, the Democrats did unveil the Justice and Policing Act today, taking steps to achieve transformational structural change to combat the pattern of police brutality and racial injustice. We do have a copy of the steps that are mentioned in this. We did receive it and for this meeting tonight to be able to speak to it. And the congressional representatives have covered the initial steps that are on here. and including making HR 35, which makes lynching a federal hate crime. So we absolutely want your support on that. If you look on the screen there, you'll see that the new piece of legislation is posted for people to be able to review. And certainly we can get it out to everyone that's on this call. But it does speak of removing barriers and barriers to prosecute police misconduct and recovering damages from officers who have violated civilians' rights, including by ending qualified immunity by law enforcement. You know, that's part of the problem. Too much immunity for folks that are committing crimes while under the cloth of supposed to be protected. The demilitarization of the police by limiting the transfer of military weaponry to the state and local police departments. Mr. McNerney, you spoke to that, and Mr. Harder as well, including by requiring the body and dashboard cameras, banning chokeholds, ending the use of no-knock warrants in drug cases, and enacting steps to end racial profiling. These are primary things that impact the African American and Latino community. Stepping up the pressure on the Justice Department to address systematic racial discrimination by law enforcement. The Justice Department has not been our friend for the last 4 years for sure, and they've been very soft for the last 15. And they no longer bring about community service from the Justice Department, where they help communities come together and work with law enforcement and citizens to have racial harmony in our communities. And I remember back in the 70s and 80s, they did do that. The Justice Department had a social services wing that got involved in communities to improve community conflict. So we need that back in there, even though that's not quite what they're saying here. Again, like I said, the anti-lynching bill, and those pieces that we're talking about and the mayor is talking about does fit in with the 10-point plan that the NAACP introduced last week at our section 1 of Saving Our Lives. We do intend to work with one of these, and we have been very much engaged with the city and the law enforcement. But we still don't, we have a chief that has the right attitude and right desire, but we have officers that are still going out and misusing people. And I know the chief is not even aware of this one yet, but last Friday, we had an officer that went in and slammed a lady down because the store called and said they were looters. When the police officer came in, the store said she's not the one, but he's got her down on the ground with his knee in her back and didn't even say, ma'am, can you just stand here a minute and let's sort this out? That's the kind of law enforcement that we don't need in our community. That's the kind of law enforcement we still continue to see, even though at the top, the desire is not to have that kind of action, but when reports are made like that, there needs to be discipline and there needs to be some cleaning of the house in those type of unwarranted behaviors. So with that, we take final comments from our panelists on this evening, and I want to thank you all for being here. I really want to thank you. And I want to give a little extra thanks to Jamal for staying out here, and we will stay open for the, if there's some extra questions. But again, let me read our 10-point plan since all of you have not seen it. Number 1, oh, okay, it's going to be projected up on the screen in just a moment. Oh, it's up here now. Okay, so 1 is the immediate no-neck restraint policy be established in all cities within San Joaquin County. Number 2, a ban on the use of knee holds, choke holds, and unacceptable practice for law enforcement officers. 3, implementation of a citizens review board for all cities within San Joaquin County with the subpoena power to hold each department accountable and build public trust. Implementation of a diverse youth advisory committee to brief law enforcement on youth issues. Police officers vetted for misconduct prior to being considered for hiring, and do not hire law enforcement office personnel whose names appear on California's Brady list or who have been decertified. The next one is allegations of police abuse should be investigated by internal affairs and an outside independent agency. A standard procedure countywide should be developed regarding what is excessive force. And then the immediate adoption of a zero tolerance policy against racism in law enforcement agencies in all cities within San Joaquin County. And then mandated psychological evaluations of police officers should take place for personnel who had more than 2 excessive force violations and or a shooting incident in the form practice of their duty, and a ban on police union campaign donations to prosecutors so that they can hold the police accountable. That's the 10-point plan from the NAACP that we introduced last week. We're introducing it to you all tonight, and we will certainly get it to you in writing, and we will be asking the mayor and the chair of the Board of Supervisors to adopt this agenda and push it forward within their respective jurisdictions. The state has come up with something similar. The federal government has now come up with something similar. So we're looking for the support of all of our elected officials. We have one now. We can ask for a 1-minute closing statement from all of our panelists, and we will shut it down for the night. And thank you very much for being here. We'll start out with you, Congressman McNerney. I'm looking across the screen.
Well, thank you, Bobby Bivens and the NAACP. Thanks, Jamal Watkins, for participating. This has been a great discussion. I mean, the real question is, how do we make this discussion real? How do we make it permanent? How do we make it effective? The 10-point plan, I think, is great. I support it wholly. I couldn't have done a better job myself. This is the first time I've had a suit on in 3 months, so I'm a little hot here tonight. There's a lot that needs to be done beyond all this, because the social issues that are causing the police brutality need to be addressed in a serious way. For example, Barbara Lee has a resolution out there which would call for a study of how to conduct reparations for descendants of slaves, HR 40. I support that. I'm a co-sponsor of that. But we need to look at, in general, there's a big disparity of wealth in this country. There's a big disparity of income. Those issues are driving people apart. And we need to look at how to address those in a serious way, in a permanent way that will move us into more ideal of equality. And we're not there. We need to keep our heads to the ground, or we're going to lose sight of this thing. Thank you for having us. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Congressman McNerney. Congressman Harder.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much again for putting this on. I really appreciate the honest conversation of some of the real issues that we're dealing with. As my colleague, Mr. McNerney, said, a big piece of what happens next is going to be translating this into action. I would also add 2 points. One is we need to make sure that we're making this sustained, making sure that the movement that is being created right now doesn't dissipate, and that we continue to put in the hard work over the coming weeks and months to translate that into real effort, not just at the legislative level in DC, but also in Sacramento and in all of our cities across the Central Valley. And we really need to spend a lot of time thinking about not just the criminal justice aspects, but some of which are addressed by the Justice and Policing Act, but all the other ways that we are dealing with systematic inequality every day. I'm on the Education Committee in Congress. That means I spend a lot of my day yelling at Betsy DeVos, holding her feet to the fire, which is almost a full-time job in and of itself. But we need to make sure that we're getting this right. We need to make sure that until every kid in the Central Valley can have a high-quality education, until every kid in the Central Valley can have the same access to health care and affordable health care, until we address some of the problems that have been existing with redlining and housing discrimination across our country's history, that is at the root of so many of the challenges that we're talking about today. And we're going to go work together and try to get it done. And thank you all for your help in making that happen.
Thank you, Congressman. Now we'll have Assemblywoman Susan Eggman.
I would echo the sentiments of my my colleagues and say thank you very much for hosting this, for having us on. Thank you to everybody who's, I just look through, there's a lot of people on this call. So I think that's one of the ways in which we sustain the movement, right? Because as the mayor said this weekend at a rally, it can't just be a moment, it's got to be a movement. And that then takes concrete steps afterwards. I am heartened by the amount of young people. I was heartened to listen to President Obama talk about, you know, when we can feel down, we look to these young people and all the fantastic things they're doing and getting out there and leading, and to find every kind of way we can to support them in that work. We need to continue to work on issues around healthcare, education, not just the police aspect of it, because it's a symptom that people have said of a larger issue of not valuing darkness. I mean, since the beginning of time, we've elevated lighter skin. That is inherent in our sort of, that is the thing that must be struck out and brought to mind every single day. I was the proud co-authors of ethnic studies. I think that needs to continue to get out. I think right now it is in order for this movement to continue, we just need to increase, I think, the understanding for everybody. I want to go back and talk about social workers a little bit more, because this idea of empathy, we seem to have lost touch with. And I think that is one of the ways that we continue to isolate from each other, separate from each other, is that we are having a hard time putting ourselves in other people's positions. So I think that kind of work is important, just the development of empathy, ethnic studies in schools. And I would also just like to speak on behalf of African-American women also. I mean, I'm not an African-American woman, but as a woman, and many single-led women households are consistently paid lower than their male colleagues. That kind of thing has to continue to change. We know Black women make the least out of everybody, and that is unacceptable. I was very proud to pass a bill last year that said you cannot ask somebody what they made at their last job when they're interviewing, because we don't want to keep people down. So I think we have to find all those kinds of ways of artificial and kind of systemic institutional ways that we have created barriers for people to be able to achieve their full potential. I think we need to continue to address those all the time. So I could go on forever. Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening, and let's continue to have these conversations, I think, as much as we can.
Thank you, Assemblymember Eggman, and you are a true advocate, and last week you were advocating for women and African-American women. So I'm hearing you be consistent in what you say, and you are one who has fought for a long time for equity. So I appreciate you, and we appreciate you.
Thank you. And I feel kind of bad that you don't have an African-American assembly member, but I feel it's my duty to do as much as I can. So I will be with the African-American caucus on the steps of the Capitol tomorrow for 8 minutes and 45 seconds on my knees.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we claim all of the African-American legislators. So if we don't have none, we got to take what we can get.
Yeah.
Supervisor Kathy Miller, final words.
Thank you. And thank you again for bringing us together to have this conversation. I do think the challenge is going to be that this does not become just one more moment that then goes away and it's business as usual. We do need to make sure that this conversation is really sustained so that we can get to the hard work that needs to be done. And, we've talked about social workers and all of these other things, the CSU campus, which are all critically important, but I'm going to go back again. the inequities begin at birth, and we need to invest in our youngest and most vulnerable residents, because that's where it starts. When you start kindergarten at a disadvantage, and then you're not reading at grade level by 3rd grade, you cannot catch up after that. And it's incumbent on us to make sure that we shift that focus in our budgets to include those services that go right to the heart of prevention down the road. So there's a lot of hard work to be done, because those are tough conversations to have. It's going to take all of us really doing some heavy lifting to make sure that those budget priorities shift and we start making a greater investment in our kids. So thank you.
Well, we thank you, Supervisor Miller, and certainly we hope you'll start out with a 10-point plan tomorrow at the Board of Supervisors meeting to make this shift start. Next, we will go to Mayor Tubbs. If he's still, okay. Yeah, you are. I didn't know whether you had another meeting.
I missed bedtime for my son, but I'm still here. And let me just
put the baby to sleep.
let me start with saying to the elected officials during this time, I thank you for your work. I know this is unprecedented to deal with COVID-19, to be forced to deal in a very frank and real way with kind of racism and legacies of white supremacy. So I thank you for your leadership, and for many of you, your willingness to listen and learn and become even more educated on these issues. And to the community, thank you all for your leadership and forcing us to speak publicly about these issues in a way that reflects an understanding of our role as elected officials. So I'll say 2 things. Number one, I think, again, the conversation started with policing, as I opened with, the real conversation is about structural violence. It's about the way our structures in our society produce outcomes that we're all upset about, that lead to nihilism and despair and frustration. But I think with the energy in this country and in this community now, we have the opportunity, if we stay focused, if we stay informed, to actually begin to change the system so they work and produce better outcomes. And that's the work of the county, the city, the school board, of everybody. And I'm sure many of you
and to serve this city with excellence in Jesus' name.
Somebody needs to mute their system. You're cutting into the mayor's statement.
I love the prayers, though. That's the second time on this call, so thank you. And secondly, I would say, I think I want to put in context some of the stuff we've been doing in the city, because it actually is on brand with this moment. So we're talking about the violence of poverty, and your city is the first city in this nation to test the basic income. That some of y'all thought was crazy. Some of y'all thought there's no way. Some of y'all were signing recall papers, but now here we are talking about, hey, how do you make sure we create economic opportunity for everyone? We talked about gun violence reduction, and hey, we have cops, but cops can't do everything. So what can we do around empowering the community? And that's why we brought the Advanced Peace Program in. And some of you were calling it cash for criminals. Some of you were saying it's the worst idea ever. And now, bam, here we are. How do we invest more money in community? We said our kids the opportunity to go to a CSU Stockton, and that's when we started Stockton Scholars. So every kid in every school district for the next decade is guaranteed a scholarship to a 2-year, 4-year trade school. And people were saying that's not real, that money should be spent elsewhere, and bam, here we are again talking about the need for higher education. So again, Stockton, I really need us to keep this level of engagement and activism all the time, and to support initiatives in our community that are doing what I heard today was the will of the community. And the last thing I'll say is, in terms of the 10-point plan, I am in, as I shared earlier, number 1, we're already doing that as a police department. Number 2, we're already doing that. Number 3, by the end of the summer, the city manager and the police chief will have a proposal for the NAACP and others to look at. Number 4, we have a chief youth advisory board that's coming online. We also have 2 youth on the board now. Number 5, we're doing that. It doesn't mean we don't have work to do, but I do think, particularly for our officers, I just want to make sure they know we see the work you're doing, and we'll continue to push for more, but we are thankful that you were doing this work before George Floyd. And in conclusion, Stockton, again, it's going to, we're talking about 400 years. of issues in a system. So it's not going to be solved in 4 days, 1 week, or 4 weeks. So we have to discipline ourselves to be engaged and do what we can each and every day. I think low-hanging fruit is the supervisor's leadership on using cannabis revenue for children. To the young people who talk to about defunding the police department, support her measure. She put it on 4 years ago and it did not pass, to use cannabis revenues to invest in our children. If we want to invest in social services, support the ballot measure. The school district, I know, is having a discussion about ending their police department. If you care about schools and not cops, as many of you guys have said on my Instagram, support that. Talk to your school board, get it going. If you're really adamant about defunding Stockton Police Department, do the hard work of organizing a ballot initiative, because there's 2 on the books from 05 and 13 that this community said, as one of the lowest staff police departments in this country, we want to tax ourselves for more cops. And again, it's not easy work, but it's the work we're called to do. And I'm excited to be your partner in it. And thank you, Mr. Bivens, and the whole executive team for your leadership and continued dialogue.
Thank you, Mayor Tubbs, and thank you for the groundbreaking work that we're doing here in Stockton. And you know, I was so happy that the Congress and passed the bill so that we could have universal money going out to everybody. And I said, now look, Stockton has led the way, and now America's getting a check.
But when Trump did it, everyone was happy. You see how they do me? That's not racism, I keep telling you.
Next, we will have Mayor Elihu Harris.
First of all, let me thank President Bivens and his boss, LaWanna Bivens. Secondly, I really want to tell you guys have an incredible group of elected officials. All communities should be so lucky. One of the things that I remember the former Prime Minister of Jamaica, Michael Manley, says, you have to act locally, but think globally. Unfortunately, all the good work you're hearing about going on behalf of your congressional representatives, Congressman Harder and Congressman McNerney, I think it's probably going to go for naught. We have a racist, reactionary Senate. If a guy like Mitt Romney can march with the protesters in Washington, but also you got a guy like Rand Paul who can hold up the Anti-Lynching Act, you got a problem in Washington. And right now it's in the White House and the Senate. We got to get people out to vote. We got to turn out people in those key battleground states. We've got to make sure we return our progressive and reasonable and forward-thinking members to Congress, to the Assembly, City Councils, and the mayor's offices and boards of supervisors. We all got to pull together. This is the team. And I want to quote Mayor Tubbs, who's very prophetic in terms of his policies and his actions. And that is, this is not a moment, this is a movement. It's been a movement for 400 years for African Americans and for this country over 250 years of effort to really make sure that the American dream of justice and equality replaces the reality of racism and economic oppression. This has been a great town hall, a great opportunity for the community to come together to discuss and to learn. Now the question is, what you gonna do with it? This is a time that demands your attention and commands your involvement. So I appreciate that I had the opportunity to be part of the Stockton community tonight, but I know this is your fight. I'm just an ally. Thank you very much.
Okay, and now, last but not least, and I want to thank you, if you're still on, Jamal, for staying on this time, because it's late on the East Coast, and I know it, and we really can't emphasize how much we appreciate you being on and staying on, in particularly. So you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, President Bivens. To the Stockton community, our members and advocates, you are deeply appreciated for your work. We are grateful to the elected officials who have joined with you, Congressman McNerney, Congressman Harder, Mayor Tubbs, Mayor Harris, Leader Miller, Assemblywoman Baird. As we think about this moment, I'm reminded of one quote, if you will, from Fannie Lou Hamer, and she talked about the notion of this concept that if you have your foot on my neck in a ditch, we're both in a ditch. Right. And when we think about where we are in this country right now, we are in a ditch. Coronavirus, high unemployment, and now structural racism rearing its ugly head. And so the fight that you all are doing in the city of Stockton, your 10-point plan, your advocacy efforts, your policy strategy is the only way we're going to get out of this ditch. And two, Mayor Harris, I think his prophetic word is very clear that if we understand how to shift political power in this country, then we know that the road and all roads lead to November. And so in November of 2020, we want to make sure that we're standing up and turning out like never before, because if we're going to get America out of this ditch, if we're going to turn a corner, if we're going to go through this hell and come out on the other side, it's going to take each and every one of us not only fighting locally, but also voting so that the man in the White House looks like our community and fights for our community, just like your neighbors and friends who are on the Zoom. And so I thank you for your leadership. I thank you for your effort and look forward to standing with you shoulder to shoulder to make this country what it ought to be.
Thank you very much, Jamal. And just a couple of quick announcements. First one is to remind everybody that it is important to fill out your census forms if you have not filled them out. If you are stuck and don't know how to do it, give us a call. Look on our website and we will set an appointment to work with you individually to fill your census form out. We need that money coming back to our community, but we also need to make sure that we are all counted. And the so-called minorities in America absolutely have to step up, because we are the ones that are left out of the financial funding process. The second announcement is we request and ask you to join and become a member of the Stockton Branch NAACP. We do need your support. We need your membership. We all need to work together and bring diverse ideas into taking the advantage of this opportunity that we're presented with right now between Corona and the demonstrations for change in our communities. So memberships are $30 a year for a regular membership, or $75 a year for a life membership with a total price of $750. You can join the Stockton Branch online at our website. So please come join us. Let's work in this fight. And as Mayor Tubbs says, it's not a moment. I've been engaged in this whole battle the whole 25 years I've been in Stockton. And we're still fighting some of the things that I was speaking to when I first came here. But I've been most so engaged since I was a child in this stuff. So I know that it's a long-term battle. You have to be patient. You have to stay on the battlefield. Otherwise, we keep starting over and over and don't make progress. So thank you all. God bless you. And I just hit. So, and then we now have, it's been an informative session. And today, I hope we feel some sense of understanding on what we can do and must do. We must have a call to action. You must ask, what can I do? This is what the NAACP Stockton Branch has recommended. There is a national legislation entitled the 2020 bill that came out today. We need you to call your congressional elected officials and your Senate officials. We also ask that you urge your city council and your board of supervisor members to adopt portions of the NAACP Stockton Branch Plan of Action. I'm presenting to you a plan for both the mayor and the chairperson of the board. You received it, and we have now read it. We're here together, and we're ready to close this out. Reverend Green, will you give us a closing prayer right quick, please? Well, Reverend Green is not there, and I'm sure Reverend Hodge is here.
Let us bow our heads. Gracious and eternal God of heaven, Father, we thank you once again for your loving kindness. We thank you, God, for the leadership that we have. We pray, God, that you continue to bless our representatives that has represented us. For you told us to write the vision upon the wall and to make it plain. Father, we pray, God, that you give us the ability and the strength to continue this fight, to fight for those that have no voices, to speak for those that cannot speak. Father, we pray, God, that you will bless everyone that is on the sound of my voice tonight, that you will give them the strength, give them the width, give them the understanding as we lead this great people from the NAACP and those that are represented. Bless our committee now in a special way. Bless those that are without today, the homeless. Oh God, give us the ability to meet the need in the name of your son, Jesus Christ. Lord God, we thank you and we praise you now. But you say, let the words of our mouth and the meditation of our hearts be accepted in our sight. But God, we will look into the hills from whence cometh our help. We need your help now. Help us to do this in the name of Jesus. Give us power. Oh God, in Jesus' name we pray. Let everybody say amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone. Executive Committee, can you stay online with our Vice President, Jamal Watkins? So please stay on. Executive Committee of the NAACP. Good night, everyone. Thank you for attending.